Hi, good evening to all of you, and welcome to the 34th Leadership Levers Lectures by Payel Ghosh. And before she begins, let me invite her to this wonderful forum. And she comes with a very illustrious experience in the analytics, especially in the fraud analytics and anti-money laundering analytics. And she has got close to about 20 plus years of experience. And she's a master's in applied economics from Presidency College. And she began her career as associated with Market RX between 2004 and 2005. And for the next 10 years, she spent wonderful time with HSBC. She joined them as business analytics, and she demoted the office as assistant vice president in 2013. 2015. And after that, she was the vice president at probably world's biggest bank. Of course, there's always debate about which is the biggest bank in the world. Is it JP Morgan Chase or is it a bank from China? But I know right now, as of today, it is the second biggest in the world. And she was vice president at JP Morgan and Chase between 2016 January and July 2019. And from September 2019 onward, she is the head of analytics and business intelligence at Godrej Capital. And the topic that she has chosen is very interesting one. I'm sure all of you must have seen it, and then I'm sure you must be looking forward to it, fraud analytics. And this is a very funny thing because, as the technology, spread is increasing in every field, because you look at fintech, insurance technology, and agriculture now, agri-tech startups have come up in big way. And you name every possible economic sphere, you're talking about, you're seeing the technology footprint. But at the same time, what is also happening is definitely the frauds, especially in financial frauds, that is increasing. But the good thing is that in India, the frauds are decreasing, especially from the point of view of the fact that recently, I think 2 months back, the Minister of State for Finance, Mr. Bhagwat Karat, has given a written reply in the Parliament House saying that there's a 50% decrease in financial frauds in the country, from 7,300 odd crores to about 3,200 odd crores. So that's a good development. But like I said, funny thing is that while somebody is there to develop technology to solve problems, but there is somebody else who's developing the technology to create problems, and that is what the problem is. And there's somebody like you, like a Payel, is the one who's going to be a savior for all of us, all of our financial savings, and ensuring that they erect all the firewalls and all the possible technology intervention to see that the best thing that can happen is prevent any possible financial fraud. And that's what she's going to talk to us about. And with her, like I said, 20 plus years of experience in advanced analytics, right, and also at AML analytics part of it. Over to you, Payel, and look forward to having a wonderful session with you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagendra, for those lovely words, and thanks for having me. And I'm really excited for this evening and for this session with all of you. Before we delve into fraud analytics, let me take a minute or two to talk a little bit about myself, just giving a background of what kind of work we've done. Of course, Dr. Nagendra took you through, my, and I think he very nicely, kind of summed up my career. Essentially, I've kind of, been like a risk analytics person, right? Working in all the different areas of risk analytics, and now the overall analytics across risk and marketing, where fraud analytics was a major part of it. Why I talk about this whole idea of fraud being a part of risk analytics, because in the course of the discussion, you'll realize that sometimes it's very difficult for us to actually differentiate as to what is a fraud risk and what is a credit risk. And a lot of the fraud risk actually gets underreported, because you might just think it to be like a credit risk. And and that's why there is no clear, while the definitions have evolved over time, but still the gray area still remains, right? So, fraud is actually a very, very huge area, and honestly, an hour is not going to justify, our time about fraud analytics out there. What I'll try and do is, talk about and touch upon different topics. Right, if you want to know a little bit in detail, we can have the sessions. We can put that in the Q&A. But what I'll try to do is just open up you guys about all possible things that we look into fraud, and what are the areas that one can develop and work on and get to know in detail. Yeah. And let's come to the definition of what is fraud, right? And if you go to the internet, you will find various definition. And I think the one most common that comes up is that how it's act of a deliberate, intentional, unethical activity, to gain any unauthorized benefit by using information that is not yours, by using things which are incorrect, and using unethical means, right? So that is what the internet talks about fraud. In the banking parlance or in the financial industry parlance, it is important for us to understand what does this fraud risk mean, right? So before we go into how to identify this fraud, let's try and understand what is this fraud risk and why is it different than the credit risk. So credit risk is basically, your inability to pay, right? So you look at a customer and you try and understand, will the person be able to pay me back? Now, fraud is a person's non-intention to pay, which means that the person might want to showcase everything that will tell the person is able to pay, right? So that's what makes it that much more difficult, because the profile that of that customer is of that of a good credit guy, because that's what the person is trying to portray, that I'm a good credit guy, I want those benefits from you. And hence there comes a challenge. The other kind of challenge that often we face is like we a lot of time, and especially with first party fraud, and I'm going to talk a little about that. We often are not able to differentiate between who's not paying back to me because of a bad credit situation versus who is not paying back to me because the person didn't intend to pay, right? And a lot of this actually go into collections, and then you're difficult to collect from the person, where you've lost all your lead of a fraudulent guy. So the biggest, and a lot of time a fraud for us becomes a post facto analysis rather than like on this rather than a predictive analysis of the person. So these are some of the challenges, and it's very intrinsically kind of linked with credit risk, and that's why I intended to point this out. Before we delve into what are the techniques by which we could identify fraud, let us take a minute to understand what are the different frauds there, right? And again, I think this is fairly common knowledge that fraud typically is three types. One is first party fraud. What's a first party fraud? Where, let's say me as a person, Payel, right? I deliberately intend to, defraud the financial organization. And hence, I will use, things, illegal means to, create a, let's say, inflated profile or a fancy profile, which is not. So the person and the bank where the fraud is happening is done by the person himself or herself. So in most cases, fraud, it's difficult to identify the first party fraud because of the reasons I just spoke about. And most first party frauds are actually categorized as credit risk. What are some of the things one can do? I could have false documentation. I could, inflate my income to get higher eligible credit limit. I could, give false documents. I could, for mortgage, I could, not just my income, I could fudge the property valuation, right? Because for your housing, your loan is also dependent on your property valuation. It's more difficult to identify, property valuation frauds out there. So you can, and so what happens is that, if things go right, it's fine. But it means that you are defaulting and the bank has to sell your property to recover your money. The bank realizes that, it's not a secure product because the house that is there is not good enough to fetch the bank money. The other things that they can do is, something that we call counterfeit checks, right? In India, counterfeit check is not that a big issue, but globally it is, and specifically in US, check kiting is also another very prevalent fraud where, what happens is there is this time frame between you giving, suppose you and another party, you're giving check to somebody else, and there is this time when the verification is happening in the system, and there's this one window where the money is made available to you, right? So the person says, so it could happen A and B are both involved. The money is made available. A picks up the money and B doesn't have it in the account. And fraudsters sometimes take advantage of that window. So check kiting fraud is very, very prevalent in the US. In India, because of the certain regulations that we have, it's difficult to actually do this. What are some of the techniques that a lot of this first party frauds happen in groups. There could be transaction between A and B, B and C, C and D, and ultimately you go ahead and actually then default. We could also talk about in first party frauds. So I think what becomes it. So the other kind of fraud that could be, you go in, first you go in, let's say as a customer, you open let's say credit card, right? And you make small payments, and you're a good behaved customer, you pay back. So your credit limit gets increased, right? Then the bank says, oh, this guy is very good. Let's give him some personal loan also. And then the person says, oh, you know what? I think there's some more capability. Let's give the person overdraft. And bang, that's when the person will go ahead, take all your money and defraud, right? And maybe some of the transactions that you see of this guy is between, this guy and some other person with whom they're complicit. So if I can, then talk about what are, some of the ways in which you can counter first party fraud. Of course, any, because let's say it's very important that you actually are able to identify the patterns out there, right? So in first party fraud, you could identify at the very beginning the person who's applying for a loan to you, whether there is any kind of using machine learning techniques, whether there is any kind of ability of the person to go ahead and fraud, right? A very interesting thing that I've observed in my life is whenever you do a credit modeling in machine learning versus a fraud modeling, if your credit modeling patterns are always let's say if I can simplistically say, is monotonically increasing or decreasing, which means, with a parameter becoming better, your credit behavior is better. In fraud, you will always see it as a U-shaped curve, right? Because they try to behave in the best pattern, most stable income level, most stable age level, most stable, industry. And that's where the maximum fraud happens. Right, so at application, at very onboarding, one can do that. The other thing which is very prevalent is that you have databases in fraud which you could connect to. If anybody's in the finance industry, they'll know that there are bureaus or there are organizations which have a database of historically proven fraudulent customers, and if these people go to any other banks, this information is shared, right? So there is Experian, which has a database called Hunter. There is Script, there's a database called Sherlock, where suppose your company is kind of registered with them. So every time an application comes, you actually kind of scan across their database to see, has this person ever done a fraud in any other organization? The third you do is, you can have, social network analysis, right? This guy is bad, and does the person who's coming to you have any connection to a bad or fraudulent person? So social network analysis also becomes very important. And one thing to remember, guys, fraud cannot be countered with only one method, right? So a fraud prevention requires a fantastic collaboration between technology, data science, and human intervention, right? It has to be an amalgamation of all these three. And I'll tell you why. Because, I can have, I need to have my technology to identify some of these things, Data science alone cannot do that. There has to be capability. I mean, data science mixed with technology has to do that. And data science alone cannot do it, because these cases, for fraud, one of the challenges is that it is a very high false positive rate, right? Because fraud happens in a very small amount, right? It's not a very common occurrence. So there's a lot of false positive when you are actually predicting false fraud, and hence there needs to be some human intervention. And also, um, you know, there is no alternate to a person interacting and finding out whether you are fraudulent or not. That's what happens. The amalgamation of these three. Let me move to second party fraud, right? A second party fraud essentially is where, or let me talk about third party fraud, and I'll give you an example about second parties. Third parties where the person who's doing a fraud with you is not the person himself or herself, right? That means a third person is illegally obtaining that information of of you, and interacting with the bank and creating the fraud. It is, of course, a problem, right? Because A, it's either a loss to the bank, or B, it's a loss to the customer himself or herself. So this is a third party fraud, and which is actually which is, the most common kind of frauds that we see. A second party fraud is where a known person, uses, or you give the known person to use your identification ID. Maybe, it could be like a bank fraud, like a staff fraud that is happening, right? And that's why a lot of banks globally have this concept of MANDOF, I think, mandatory off, so that you are able to identify if there's any pattern in staff frauds or not, in that mandatory off period. A lot of times, and specifically you will see that sometimes when there are foreign students who are coming and working, studying, when they go back, they sell their identity, or other people use their identity, right, for fraudulent activity. So I think those would be categorized as second party fraud. Now let's come to third party fraud. It's actually very interesting, this whole third party fraud. Let's try to identify. Let's try to categorize some of this third party fraud. I could have a third party fraud where my documents. It could be a fraudulent ID, right? So I could use up somebody's ID to open an account. So the ID is all actually correct, right? But I am not that person. So it could be like a stolen identity, or it could be, a stolen card. Card comes to an address and I just pick up the credit card saying, it's not mine, but I pick it up and I start using it. Or it could be a stolen credit card, which is kind of, we know it's rampant, right? Or somebody gets details of your credit card. Jamtara, I think many of us saw the series Jamtara, perfect example. Then there is account takeover, where the person changes your password and takes up the account himself or herself. There is another very interesting fraud that is coming up now, called synthetic ID. I think there's a lot of discussion about saying that should it be categorized as third party fraud, or it's a big enough issue for us to actually look at it separately. And so what's synthetic identity? So third party fraud, it becomes after some point, very quick to identify that, this guy is not the guy who's pretending it to me. So, if I start using Dr. Nagendra's ID, at some point of time, that information comes to the bank and the bank is able to identify and stop it, right? Or the merchant or whosoever. But, the synthetic ID is actually not real ID. They will use, they will mix and match different actual information to create a ID which does not exist in actual life, right? But it has actual, let's say, PAN ID, it has actual date of birth, so the various components are correct, right? And then it becomes that much more difficult to identify because there's nobody to complain about it. So synthetic IDs are actually taking the fraudulent world by storm. And Dr. Nagendra kind of touched upon it. We, as an analyst, we might come out with the fanciest models or the best technology or great, human interaction to identify and prevent fraud. Believe me, fraudsters are even better at it, right? That's their bread and butter, I think. So you are always one step behind them. So they are, fantastic at it, and you'll be amazed by some of the technologies that they use, and some of them are so advanced, and some of them are so simple, and they take, they will. I've had situations where there used to be this 1 minute gap between a downtime of an ATM when I was to work for a UK market, and between that 1 minute, like 11:59 to 12, or one, there was this 1 minute downtime for system upgrade, and we used to have so many frauds in that time. And interestingly, that whole downtime got shifted to after, let's say 40-50 minutes. And after 7-8 months, they realized that whole thing moved to the 30-40 minutes. So the fraudsters are extremely cunning, and it's difficult to keep up with them. Uh, and hence that's why I say, for synthetic IDs are actually the new thing, new fraud thing that is not new. It's fairly old, but it's increasingly becoming a bigger issue. Now, so let's look at some of the methods by which, and let's just do a little bit of deep dive as to how can we identify, right, some of these frauds. And again, this is a huge topic, and I'm going to say, I'm going to be just touching and talking about it, because each topic deserves one hour of session. But the idea is to leave you guys with these thoughts so that you can do a further research and get to know about it, right? Like I said, technology is your biggest friend, when you're trying to do a fraud prevention. One of the things that happens a lot is in terms of, interestingly, this whole device mapping and device pattern analysis, right? So, banks are able to identify that where is the transaction happening from, right? And it could happen because I could have a transaction from my laptop, and I could have a transaction from my mobile phone, and I could have the transaction from my iPad. And I could have a transaction sitting in my laptop in office, and I could have a transaction in my laptop sitting at home with a different IP. So it's very important for the banks to be able to, or whoever is working on it, to be able to do this whole device analysis and device pattern, and identify that, what is actually happening, and be able to trigger when something goes, beyond the, beyond the known trends, right? And like I said, sometimes not all triggers are actually fraudulent, right? Because it could so happen you've just gone to, go and decided to do a transaction. So, and so that's where a whole lot of false positive comes, but you do the maximum probabilistic thing. So, for example, if you use your credit card to buy a ticket for Goa, and you're going to go and making a transaction which is usually not seen, it should not be kind of triggered. So device analysis becomes very, very important, because not just your payment mode, but the payment mode along with device is a very important indicator. Now let's go to this very interesting thing of transaction pattern, right? Most of the third-party triggers that you will see across the globe, and there are a lot of third-party triggers that are there, and they are based on your transaction pattern, right? So what is a transaction? So the whole idea of fraud identification is that how am I able to identify an anomalous transaction, right? What is the transaction that Payel does, and what is that one transaction? Is this transaction something she'll do? That's what the machine is trying to identify. That no, I don't think this is what Payel will try to do. So let's take an example, right? So if I am like an office goer, right, and Monday to Friday I'm in office, highly unlikely, like on a Thursday, 3 to 4, I'll go to a retail shop and buy something. Now, and maybe this could be, again, this is not a great example, but just, typically you will not see an office goer doing a retail shopping during that period of time. right? Or let's say, a person who does not spend a lot on, suddenly a gold is being bought, right? And typically this person does not spend money on gold. So the whole idea is that you identify what is the pattern the person is not, what's this anomalous pattern, payment pattern is this person doing? Or again, if the person is doing a multiple, mistakes in typing password, but that's very common. But the transaction behavior is very, very interesting, and I think that actually opens a door for us to do a lot of different types of analysis. And there are lots of techniques that you can use, right? You can, in fraud, we typically, because your fraud rate is very, very small, some of the traditional methods don't work, right? And that's why some of these newer age machine learning methods are more applicable here, like a random forest and gradient boosting. And maybe I'm going to talk a little bit about this in later. But so a lot of things can be done in basic pattern analysis, or a lot of time what people do is maybe you've lost your credit card in a store and somebody's bought it. They might not immediately use it up, right? They might just try out small amounts, and if they are just passing through, bam, they'll make a big one. And I've actually had this, personally, my mom, I've had this in my family, so I know, they did all this, very small transaction in buying CDs, and then bam, they did a big transaction. The other thing that there's a lot of work that's going on is on geospatial analysis, right? So, for example, if I am buying, let's say, petrol in a petrol pump in Delhi, right? Highly unlikely in next half an hour I'm going to go and have dosa in Chennai. So these are actually very interesting pattern, how you combine the geospatial, location of the card, saying that this is not possible. The time does not permit that. And sometimes it might happen, right? And because you ordered in Swiggy, maybe your like your husband's traveling outside and he just used your card number to buy Swiggy in Chennai, and you're buying petrol out there. So that can happen, but that's why I said, false positives are there, but the chances of this being a fraudulent activity is a lot more. So I think these are some of the techniques, and I think in all of these, the overarching analysis that comes out here is the anomaly detection, right? How are you as a person able to identify whether this transaction, this behavior, this activity is anomalous to the existing customer's pattern of transacting? And that's all about it, right? So the various techniques can be used, and if I am permitted to use a little bit of technical term, so let's say in machine learning also, right? So typically I can break down my methods into let's say supervised learning versus unsupervised learning, right? So my supervised learning is that I provide the machine or the algorithm with the ability to say that help me identify this pattern. So I give the machine saying this is what I'm trying to identify, right? So I supervise the learning of the machine, saying that I want to identify persons who default on their credit card, right? So go figure it out from your data. So then the algorithm will train or supervise the model, saying that let's identify whether this person's defaults or not. What is unsupervised? Where I don't give a definition. So they need to go ahead and find out how are things different. So clustering, for example, what are the logical groups that can happen, which are specifically, are similar and dissimilar. And there is no, defined way by which you're doing this cluster. Even within supervised, unsupervised learning, there is things called regression and there's called classification. So I think there are various techniques that one can be used. Some of the common techniques that I have used or is used in the industry, for fraud identification is, you use neural network, right? Neural network where so it's a deep learning method where you I try and identify an anomalous pattern. Bayesian network is again another very is used. Isolation forest is something that can be used, or even random forest and gradient boosting, specifically because your pads are very small. Uh, the other thing that you can also work on is the linkage analysis. Like we mentioned, for example, if there is, you might be able to create links, right? For example, let's say there's a fraud ring, right? And we are trying to defraud. And there is this 5 telephone numbers which the 10 of us use to defraud. Sometimes you can build this whole graph database where you can find out A is linked to B is linked to C, and C is using a mobile number which is fraudulent, and A also uses a mobile number which is fraudulent, and create this entire graph database on linkages, for primary linkages, secondary linkages, and create this whole analysis. So I think that's also another very interesting thing that can be done. So this is, roughly, some of the things that we do in the industry to identify, fraudulent customers. Now, in terms of, let's talk about some of the challenges that that we might come across. Challenges that you might come across when you're doing fraud. Like I said, the biggest challenge of fraud is the huge false positive rate, and sometimes it's very difficult to manage that false positive. B, fraud has to be real. Fraud has to be a real time thing, and that's a very big challenge. Sometimes you are you are 2 days behind, and the person is already upgraded. So by the time you analyze the pattern and you say that this is fraudulent thing, the person would have switched to a different method. So that's also a challenge. That happens. Sometimes it is very important for us to define what is fraud. Like I said, you don't even know that's fraud, and hence you're not able to analyze it properly. See, other thing is in terms of technology, and and I'll be candid, and this is not just a fraud issue. We talk a lot about machine learning, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, but truth be told, a lot of these are more theoretical than actually implementable. And not because I'm saying it's difficult to implement, because there are challenges, because there are legacy systems in financial organizations for them to be able to, implement such a fast changing environment. Let's take, things like, it's slightly easy for organizations like me, like us, let's say Godrej, where we just, started, right? So we can, set up. But let's think of, let's say, our HDFC, ICICI, Axis. They have legacy systems since years. For some analytics guys to say, I want to build something that takes data, in fast pace and it changes. You can't change a bank's legacy system in 5 years. So some of these things are, a little difficult to implement because there are legacy systems. Some of them are practical challenges, right? While we say that I want my model to be, have real-time learning, but think of the whole technology cost, where if you're constantly upgrading your model and your technology, it becomes a huge technology cost, right? So I think that's also one challenge that you might have. The other thing is that because it has huge false positive, customer experience sometimes is is impacted. Fraud in India is slightly more controlled than globally, and because some of our structures are much better, and a simple thing, in US, UK, PIN came so much later. And they don't, you're not mandatorily supposed to put PIN for a long time for chip and PIN. It's old, but I think in India we had that long time before, that whole chip and PIN credit card. So, customer experience is also, a challenge. I think, then the other thing is, sometimes it's a reputation risk also, right? Because, sometimes a third party might use Like I think somebody just mentioned a question, and I think maybe I'll just make a segue, though we'll take questions later. And I'll give an example. Very recently, and I've seen in a couple of areas that, some people suddenly call up and say that you have not paid your utility bill, right? Pay it immediately and we'll help you pay it out. And then they'll, ask you to download a remote desktop sharing in your, mobile. You do that, they read your information like this. Now it doesn't strike to them, or even for a bank they'll say I'm Citibank, right? But it doesn't strike to them that some third party is doing. It's a Citibank's reputation that's actually at risk. A lot of time these fraudulent activities would, so for example, I know for sure if it goes to, somebody senior in my family, for them, non-payment of a bill is a huge thing, right? They'll not think twice. They were like, let's just get this done. It doesn't matter how much money it is. So I think that is a chance, so it is very important for us as customers also, and account holders in bank, to be very, very cognizant of these calls, right? Banks will never call you up and say details. Banks will never call you up and say give me CVV, OTP. Banks will never show urgency. Most of the spam calls that come to you, or most of the time they ask you details, is a very common way of, especially the mails that come to you for details. I'll tell you what are the common ways of identifying they're trying to fish for details. One is they will come with a huge amount of urgency, like give me today, or else, the dana pani ban for you, like all money will be gone. So huge sense of urgency. Banks never come and say, they will give you timeline. Or if you see, if you look very, you should look very closely to the email ID from where it's come. The name of the email ID might be, let's say, XYZ bank, but if you go to the email ID, you will see some personal email ID, right? So that's actually an indication that there's a phishing happening. Urgency. A lot of these spam email IDs have a lot of emails have a lot of spelling mistakes. So these are very three quick, ways of identifying whether somebody is fishing for information for you. There is always, if you feel that something has happened, immediately, call up your bank and, block your card, block your thing. You can always get a chance to, unblock it. But if you feel that has happened, you should always go ahead and do it. See, in general, there are a lot of, multiple, what we say, MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication that is there. You will have debit card numbers and OTPs, keys, etc. CVV is another, another way of making sure that, there is, the transaction is happening correctly. So banks also deploy a lot of, they ensure there are a lot of security. And as customers also, we should be very, very cognizant of what is happening. And, sometimes this, and it's not our fault, because they call you with so much of urgency saying that, this is happening, that is happening, or, we are putting this amount of money in your account, do that. So it's very easy to follow. Just being cognizant, being aware is what kind of helps us to ensure such a thing does not happen. So I think these are the main things that I wanted to cover. The other thing that I do want to call out here is that it is important for us to be able to the ability or agility. I mean, although I did mention this as a challenge in terms of that, I think one of the things that needs to happen in fraud analytics is, the agility of with which any analysis needs to be implemented. And this I say because, a lot of time for us, we will see data, we will see pattern, then we will, analyze, and then we'll go and tell, this is strategy or the product head, and then we're going to go and tell the tech person, and the tech person is going to say, chalo, let's put this in this sprint. and then you are implementing a strategy a month after or 2 months. I mean, if you're lucky, a month after, right? 2 months after it. By that time, that pattern has become irrelevant, right? So that's actually a very, very big challenge. I think so. It's important. Sometimes even if you're not able to implement the full-fledged of a strategy systematically, can we disseminate this information to front end stuff so they can do some manual deliberation in their mind and implement it, right? So I think it's always important that we are agile in taking calls, making decisions, and till the full analysis is done, one is able to have some stopgap arrangement, right? I think one of the topics we had thought about discussing was that what are some of the key metrics that one needs to look into fraud. Honestly, so identifying so real time monitoring for frequent and regular monitoring in fraud is very important, right? Both in terms of being able to identify what is my regular pattern, if there's a sudden spike or dip that gets translated back. Also in terms of conversion rates, right? Volumes coming from certain channels, certain types of transaction happening. So that means that the entire monitoring needs to be very tight. And sometimes it's not possible for us to be able to go through each and every matrix, right? And hence there needs to be some automatic way for us to be able to create triggers saying, I don't need to look into the 1,000 matrix, but I need to look into the matrix moment there is a, let's say suddenly spike or it goes beyond an accepted level, right? So I think that is something that needs to be done. I think I think something I missed talking about, and it's just coming back to me, is that, we talked a lot about fraud and fraud identification. The other kind of thing, which, is it's becoming a big issue is this whole money laundering, right? Now, money laundering in true sense is not fraud, because money laundering is not loss for the bank, right? Bank does not lose out on money. Bank loses out on reputation. That's it. There is no loss of money that happens from the bank. But why is it important, right? Because a lot of this money laundering goes into converting black to white. Yes. It also goes into financing terrorism, right? A political game or whatever. So it's very important to be ensuring that your structures is not used for these games. And hence this whole money laundering, it becomes very important. It's not similar to fraud in terms of the impact, but it's very similar to fraud in terms of identification. Because here also, you are also trying to, identify patterns of anomaly, right? So typically if somebody makes payment, typically somebody does a transaction of 10,000, 10,000, 10,000. Suddenly there's a 55,000 or 2-3 lakhs. Where is that money coming from, right? So sometimes the triggers that banks have are basis that. And then actually you have very, very interesting people, right? In, like, for example, in the UK or US, there is a amount beyond which you need to make a declaration. Let's say it's $10,000 or something. They will do 9,950. Right. So banks now started saying that I will check anything that goes from 9,500. Right. Or, we've had very interesting, like how they do it is this whole money laundering. For example, in India, it's actually prevalent. Let's say, you are given, you buy train tickets, right? You buy train tickets digitally, right? And then you cancel. So there are 15,000 people, let's say there are like 1,000 people who are given asked to buy train tickets, and then you cancel, and all that money comes to them from different sources. It becomes black to white. Or, it happens a lot in I think some of the Middle Eastern countries provide education assistance to their students, right? When some of the students go abroad, they typically give allowances saying that, because you're a good student, we'll give you for buying books. So a lot of them buy books and they sell it off. So now that's hard cash in the system. right? A lot of these 9/11, actually 9/11 funding happened through this, where a lot of this book sell was kind of not book sell per se, a lot of these mechanisms were used. Another anomalous transactions that I have personally done and analyzed once, there was this one trader that we had who used to do trade finance with us, and he used to do shipments, right? And then when we did a deep dive, we realized the shipment was of flowers, and we said, what flowers are you like sailing for 3 months? And that's not, and then we realized that that was basically a money laundering that was happening. A lot of money laundering happens what we call casa de cambio, right? Where, let's say, money houses, not Thomas Cook, these are pretty big ones. There could be small money houses, and especially in Spain it happens, right? Where there is no actually there is no way of understanding the dollars that they're giving out, right? How much of the dollars are for actually travel, versus how much is for like this whole money currency conversion. So some of these activities, though not fraud, but the money laundering is very interesting because it helps you identify patterns which are anomalous. Of course, money laundering is slightly more where you also mix this whole pattern identification with known sources, known let's say terrorist linkages, known sanctioned countries, right? Whether there's a fund movement that's happening to North Korea, or there is certain known organizations and their associates are getting some money or not. So of course that part is in additional part of it. But the animal detection part remains the same. I think we sort of covered many points to it. I would probably want to take a step back here and want to understand if there is any other questions that anybody would want to ask me, because I might have covered many topics in quick succession, and there could be some questions if anybody has, anybody can ask me.
I think, thank you so much, Payel. I think it's a wide coverage, and we have sufficient number of questions also. Let's see how best we can take them. But before that, I just have one basic question. I think we have seen, I don't want to name those banks, but it happened in India, but it happened with American Express Bank also. I think that's largely with, the credit cards it started. So what happened, it is documented also. Now, the front end is very aggressive. The sales people are very aggressive because they wanted to sell the credit card. And in India, the loan portfolios, the way they are very aggressive in selling the loan portfolios, both retail as well as the corporate customers and things like that. Now, so when you see that the front end people are absolutely aggressive in selling those financial products, Payel, because they want to, because that's their at the end of the day, you have this asset liability management kind of thing, right? Other way of looking at anti-money laundering. Now, what we're looking at therefore is that when these people have been so aggressive in trying to sell the final product, now what will happen is that in the process of trying to make that the very good top class balance sheets and things like that, now they were also supposed to be, or they were caught, in trying to resort to some unethical means, or whatever you call it, eventually they were ending up as a fraud. So therefore, now, because you said some time back, is I think one of the important things that you have to have, whatever technology that you use, but still you need to have that human intervention, right? Because so therefore, so when you're going so aggressively in trying to make good your the sales, the financial product sales, do you find that do you find a mechanism where somebody needs to regulate their behavior? Because it's not the other way around, where you actually, when the fraud happens, then you start looking at it. But I'm saying even during this whole thing, when you're trying to sell your financial product, because that's where you get the top line from. So therefore, is there any way that somebody can have this human intervention to regulate that behavior? So therefore, there's a thin line of difference between the aggression and the fraud, because at some point of time they end up doing that.
Sure. And you know what, Dr. Nagendra, it's just not a fraud issue. I think it's just it's like a much bigger behavioral issue that happens. And it is a challenge, honestly speaking, not just for global banks, even for local banks. I think there could be, we can decide to have a very high and mighty ethical stance sitting in an AC head office and, with nice greenery outside. And there's this poor guy, who's, like running pillar to post in the heat of Delhi, trying to just get that extra card, just which will help him put, let's say some help him pay his rent. It is a hard fact of life, right? Like the policies unfortunately are made by people, who are disconnected from the ground, to be very honest with you. But I think it's important to ensure that your organization's DNA is hammered into your employees, right? Till the time when they cannot think of anything. You have to make sure you are hammering and telling them the right thing to do. But it is also very important for us to have the right incentive structure in place, right? And the right right monitoring in place. So what do I mean by incentive structure, right? A lot of time, just blindly telling that this volume, this let's say this sale, just give me sales, you will get your incentive, might not be the answer. Give me sales and give me a good customer NPS should be an equal amount of let's say weight, not equal of some weight, right? But you actually put back the responsibility of not just the what you're doing, but how you're doing, right? So some of this how behaviors have to be recognized, monitored, and has to be appreciated. So that people do that. At the same time, you need to ensure that your systems are sometimes are enough intelligent, I might say, to ensure some of these workarounds are not done, right? So it's a very simple thing, like somebody is putting fraudulent PAN IDs, right? But if you build your system in such a way that the PAN ID format, it will not take than the accepted PAN ID format, right? There are certain, so you can build in some of these intelligences in your front-end system. You can build in the intelligence where, moment somebody keys in a PAN ID, it hits the, NSDL base and it finds out, right? So A, you make your systems intelligent enough so that somebody is not able to outrun it. B, you do a regular monitoring to ensure none of these things are happening. Regular monitoring is very important in all aspects. C, you incentivize a good behavior, right? And D, policymakers need to be grounded.
Absolutely. Now, we have quite a few questions. Let's see how best we can take most of them. So this is a question from Mr. Ramshankar Roja Payel. And this question is, does check bounce will be considered as a fraud and any legal option for it?
I'm sorry, I did not get the question.
Does the check bounce will be considered as, is check bounce considered as a fraud and any legal option for it?
So legally in India, we can charge a criminal, we can file a criminal case if there's check bounce. That's the legal thing, right? Because you are supposed to keep your account funded so that the bounce does not happen. But banks don't do that because, it's not people are doing, it's not that people are doing it intentionally. But if you ask me the legalities, a bank can, file a criminal charge for check bounce. But the check bounce as such as an act of in itself is not a fraudulent activity, but could be a means to do, like I talked about check kiting, right? Where, there's this one, period when, money is made available and then you withdraw it and this check also gets bounced, right? So people do take use of this to, carry out fraud, but the activity is not always related to fraud. But in truest sense, if a bank wants to, and in a lot of cases when there are defaults happening, bank can, file a criminal charge against you for check bounce.
Thank you. This is the question from Mr. Ratnapratim Chowdhury, and he has got two questions, Payel. His first question is, I'm working on a BFSI project and what's meant by wire fraud and wire transfer or transaction. It will be helpful if you could add some light on this. This is the first question, Payel. And the second question is quite his question is, second question, in some cases, if someone is doing money transaction for 1,000 rupees in a day or a week, but all of a sudden he's taking out more than 1,000 rupees from ATM or through digital wallet at the same, at the time, bank has a right to block his account temporarily. In this scenario, AI and analytics, do they play significant value as a trigger bank something is wrong going on? Thank you, Ratnapratim.
So, wire fraud is where, money transaction happens through, any digital platform, and, where a fraudulent activity might can happen. And a way to identify could be, which browser main menu is being used, from which source to which source is it being done, what kind of endpoints are there, what is the frequency, what is the relevance. So all of these can be looked into when you are looking into a wire fraud. Typically, a lot of time people use, what we say, and nowadays you can also do. I think I'm not sure, but probably WhatsApp money transfer or all of these would also fall into that category. I think where different digital mediums are used for money transfer. But again, like endpoint. Important thing is to look into endpoint frequency, amount, type of transaction, relevance of transaction, timing of transaction, and be able to identify. The second question was regarding
the when he's found to withdraw more than 1,000 rupees, right? I mean, suddenly he's found to be withdrawing more money in a day or a
yeah.
week. Then does analytics or this mechanism alert the system?
Yeah, so yes, it does, it does. And but I would say yes or no to your answer. It's not always this is going to be it. So a lot of things are looked into it. This is one of the parameters where you feel that this should not happen. So this is one of the parameters where the transaction can be stopped. In lot of places, a transaction can be fully stopped, a transaction can be delayed, right? You might not want to fully stop it because it's a customer reputation at stake. You might want to delay or put it on hold and call up the customer and then release it. So most often than not, these transactions are put on hold for additional verification, rather than suspending the account as a whole.
Okay. So the next question that we have is from Ashish Maitra. His question is: thank you for presentation. His question is, the good technologies are okay, but then the bad ones are distracting. Is cannibalization, that is a new technology, happening? That's what his question is, Payel.
Cannibalization of what? I mean,
I think cannibalization, in the sense, I think what he meant is that while you're inventing the new technology, right, while it is helping you to make sure that you're trying to make sure that you're able to prevent the frauds and things like that, but at the same time, the same technology might also be used to undo all the good things this new technology is supposed to do. That's what I think he meant by cannibalization. It's only from the point of view of newer technology.
Yeah. So, at any point of time, typically, there are multiple fraud rules that go on, right? Because it's very difficult to actually identify patterns using a single. So, you will always have cases where there are multiple fraud rules going on. In terms of cannibalization, I don't think there's a whole lot of cannibalization that happens. There could be, there can be incremental alerts that come in, right? So the issue could be in terms of, and typically one moves to new methods. Because the first one has given you high false positive, right? So then usually if there's a method that is giving you high false positives, you would tend to move out of that methodology, because that means your methodology is no longer relevant to identify fraud. And in fraud, that typically happens, you move from one method to other, and there are transition periods when both are running. So I will not say cannibalization, but there is a chance that at a transition period, your false positives go up. But when there is a transition into the new methodology, that's going to come down. And the whole idea of building a new methodology is to ensure that your false positives are going down.
One simple, I mean, maybe a very basic question for Payel is that I think a whole lot of things, we have been talking about, different challenges and, inconsistencies and things like that, in as well as fraud detection as well as prevention is concerned. But in your experience, Payel, anywhere in India or across the globe, has there been a situation where we actually have prevented while the the fraud is actually happening? It therefore the system is so alert that somebody it is raise the red flag, and then it is able to block the transaction, because I think, like you rightly said, most of the cases is the deep maybe post facto kind of thing. So therefore it's already done with, and now you just have to do the post analysis. But I don't know how much of it is helpful.
Uh,
Maybe, yeah,
yeah.
but honestly speaking, anywhere in the world, because you would have seen, like you rightly said, some of these tech guys are wizards. They are really, and maybe 2 years ahead of the rest of the people. So therefore, was there any situation where while it is happening, that fraud was prevented? I mean, it's just didn't happen.
Actually, for credit card all the time. Now, for credit card all the time, because that's the most common kind of like, so credit card transactions, you try making a gold payment with credit card, immediately you get a call saying that,
Okay.
is the transaction that you're doing. So that's actually fraud prevention. Some rule has run and the alert has been raised and somebody's calling you. So if you did not make the gold purchase, the transaction would not go through, right? Or, even sometimes if you're doing a international travel, and if you're making a payment in a foreign country, they will immediately call you up and say, is this the transaction that you're doing? So credit card, it actually happens all the time. In terms of others also, there have been, a lot of time, like geospatial analysis actually works pretty well. I've had experiences where we worked on ATM frauds, right? So we used to have this, there was this problem where in ATM, you could put in a check and say, oh, sorry, I made a mistake. And then the check would come out, and then, or you would say, the person used to just pick up some money and say, oh, I did not pick up the whole money. So there was something going on in one of the banks, and we actually observed it for a week. Within a week, we were able to identify that pattern, and we closed it. And that was a pretty quick, turnover. So I think it does happen, and it's not that it does not happen. It does happen, but but newer trends come every time, and because the interesting thing with fraud, it's very short-lived pattern. You will not see a pattern that somebody's done today, they'll do it 6 months, right? So moment you're able to stop that one kind of pattern, a new kind of pattern emerges. So you need to be always on your toes. But it is possible, and fraud is, we are able to kind of prevent fraud, and especially in credit card, it happens all the time.
And the other thing that we continue to notice in India, Payel, is that very strange, but maybe I'm sure some steps have been taken. Very, I think, 2-tier cities and 3-tier cities have become very vocal in terms of these frauds. For example, I mean, we would have seen a lot of Indian, for example, let's say somebody in something like Lucknow, Ahmedabad, Allahabad, for example, right? Next one, Varanasi, right, and Patna. I know these are all the cities, and of course, Pune, of course, Mumbai and Delhi happen to the topmost. There's no doubt about it. But then what you also see is, some of the cities, tier 2 and tier 3 cities also coming up on the radar as far as this financial frauds are concerned. I mean, how come these guys have so much of technology at their disposal? Is it that somebody is using them to as maybe via media to commit this fraud, or is it that they are, I mean, truly technologically advanced?
Intelligence there is everywhere. Tier 2, tier 3 intelligent people are everywhere. And so I think, it's, I'll tell you what is happening, with digital literacy. The penetration of digital use, and as it improves in India, right, access to these digital mediums, access to digital literacy per se, right, I think these will, that's why, we see more of this in front end, right, front ending. I mean, if I take 10 years back, right, how many laptop users did we have in, tier 2? I mean, I'm not disrespecting any tier 2, tier 3 cities. Myself, I've grown up with.
Yeah, exactly.
But just in sheer numbers, the access and the usage was, mostly very urbanized, right? But with this whole technology, penetrating to everywhere, it's become easier for people to, just use mobile, change SIM cards, make this call, and now everything is available. So for example, people don't need to go to the bank to do a transaction. So all of so for people to transact, everything has come digitally. And the digital access has gone down to, it's a two-pronged thing. Earlier all this transaction would happen physically. Now these transactions are happening digitally, and the digital access has gone down to really all parts of India. And like in India, like how many and we always make a fun of it in our organizations that your uh, bank penetration, like there's a much bigger mobile penetration or even social media penetration in India than banking penetration, right?
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
these are some of the reasons as to why you will see. Also, social media has been a big, hand in that. Everything is available. You just Google that, how do I do a fraud? You probably have it on YouTube to begin with, right? So all
In,
this information is very readily available to people, and they can bypass it very quickly.
in fact, I know maybe we take before we take the next question. Payel, somewhere I have written a very interesting expression. I don't know, maybe if good or bad way of looking at it. Somebody coined this expression called as digital Robin Hoods. These people, and, so in the sense that they try to glorify these people, because they're trying to take the money away from the so-called stinking rich people. That's a different. I mean, that's there happening. But I think next question we have is from Mr. Gaurav Kamal, and his question is, ma'am, can you throw some light on machine learning and fraud and evaluation? Thank you, Gaurav.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm missing your thing on.
Can you throw some light on machine learning on fraud or fraud evaluation?
Yeah. So Gaurav, what happens is if I look into credit risk, right, and traditional methods actually have worked very wonderful on it because you have large volumes, right, and what we call a bads, like credit bads. So it's easier to do, like this traditional models of logistic regression and identifying. With fraud, what happens is that my volume of fraud is so low. So my ability of my machine to identify fraud needs that much more advanced technique. And that's why machine learning actually is, more, has been more, I would say, successful and efficient in fraud rather than credit risk, right? Of course, credit risk is also there, but it's more efficient in fraud because traditional methods actually are not that successful in fraud. So like I mentioned, like some of the machine learning techniques, and typically you can use supervised, unsupervised machines. And I did catch up a little bit, or touch upon a little bit in my discussion some of the techniques which are used quite a lot in fraud is neural network, Bayesian network, isolation forest, gradient boosting, random forest. So these are techniques that essentially help you identify a smaller default category, and also it helps you identify anomalous transaction from a huge volume of transactions. But what is very important is that to be able to define your frauds, right? So when you make you ask your machine to learn up how to identify frauds, you need to be able to give a good definition of what is that fraud. I think that actually is very, very important.
Thank you. I think with your permission, we are almost 7, 10. Can I take 2 more questions or 3 more questions? 5.
Sure.
Good. So this is the question from Mr. Nikhil Jain. His question is, good evening, ma'am. Why financial auditors are not liable for a penalty in case of failure to unravel frauds in India, unlike in United States?
Um, I'll be very honest. I actually don't have an answer for this. It's not. I'm not really very sure on this. But if I had to take a stab at it, fraud has not been that much of a evil for that much of a challenge for the Indian financial market. That for US, if you really look at the US numbers, it's really a staggering fraud. The fraud losses are really staggering in US, right? Hence, it's actually a bigger challenge there. In India, we are just about, we are rising to this whole fraud issue. And most of our frauds are very dependent on this whole ID document identification, whether it's, document is fraudulent or not, or, the database which we check if the fraud is happening or not. But, it's a very, very recent phenomena that my fraud has suddenly jumped up in India, and I think that is why probably maybe the cognizance of fraud as a risk is something that's slowly coming up, and not has been a very, very prevalent thing in India as it has been in the US, UK. But honestly, I am probably not the best person for this answer.
Great. This is the last but one question for you, Payel, and this is a question from Ms. Komandori Sanjana, and she has two questions. First one is, what are the steps being taken by banks to safeguard against UPI usage frauds? And the second one is, uh, please share some ways to avoid falling prey to such UPI usage frauds. Thank you, Sanjana.
So I think UPIs. See, I think one of the challenges, one of the things that came up a couple of days is where where we saw people were using a different QR code. And it was which was essentially going to which was essentially going to a different account than it was supposed to be. So UPI fraud can happen two ways. A, the customer himself or herself is getting, is losing out, or even the merchant sometimes loses out from UPI fraud, right? So the UPI fraud is can happen both way. And in typically in India, we've seen that most of these UPI frauds are actually happening in the urban areas. So I think what banks are doing is they're adding in more on more more on more, let's say, multi authentication, right? For example, for Google Pay, you need to give your PIN over and above just scanning it, right? Even for a Paytm, earlier the PIN was not there. The PIN thing got added, I think about 2 years back, right? So the additional PIN authentication has come in. There is also they've also started doing this whole transaction pattern analysis at their end. Merchants have now started moving into rather than you typing in the amount, they giving you the direct amount which can be deducted. So that thing has also happened, right? Now, what also happens is that how do you make sure that you do not do that? Never share your UPI PIN. Like anything else, never share your UPI PIN. Make sure that I don't know how you do that, since now everybody, even like a vegetable vendor, takes UPI. But I think I would say earlier we were conscious about to whom we were making the UPI payment, right? The other thing, I sometimes feel that I would one could do is, if somebody wants to be extra cautious, never link out your UPI account to where you keep all your money, right? Maybe you can keep it to a Paytm wallet and do that. But the whole thing is that, don't give the details through SMSs. Don't give somebody your PIN. As much as possible, do the bill transaction. That's
Great. So last question for today evening, Payal, this is from Mr. Abhijit Kotastane, and his question is, good evening, ma'am. Does the AI ML algorithm alert the bank authority when there are consecutive transactions in a matter of few minutes involving high amounts? Since this is generally the trend, heard from people affected, as the fraudster tries to encash maximum as soon as it gets hold of a link. Thank you, Abhijit.
Yeah. So Abhijit, the answer to you is yes or no, right? Because yes, because high value transactions is part of the maybe like multiple fraud rules that are there. No, because it's never looked into isolation, right? So all of these fraud rules would never run in isolation. They always run in an amalgamation and a combination of many fraud rules. But high value transaction alert is part of most banks, alert mechanism. We're saying that, the banks are alerted about it. Sometimes what can happen is that, historically, if somebody's seen that, you do tend to transact, 1 or 2 lakhs in middle of because of your, let's say, you have a salary account and you're transacting it for investment into a different account. And they have typically seen you do that. So they might not alert it, right? But if it is beyond, let's say, a very simple thing, a lot of places would probably do something like, and I'm not saying banks do, but you could look into your trend saying, mean plus right standard deviation, right? If only it breaches the mean of your transaction, of all your historical transactions plus twice standard deviation of your historical transaction, then only I'll alert it, right? So there's a combination of lot of rules that go in, never in isolation, but yes, high value transactions are a very important part for the bank alert system.
Thank you so much, Payel. I think we can take most of the questions because of lack of time, but absolutely interesting to have wonderful perspectives. And although less time, but I think thanks to you, we could cover quite a big ground. Of course, it's never ending because as we are talking about some solution, I think there's somebody who is even more creating bigger problems. So I think that's how the life of if somebody like you is going to be even more, all the time agile. I think whether they're agile or not, but they're going to keep, this one agile. But thank you so much. I think it's wonderful to have your perspective, and I think this shows complete 20 plus years of experience in this field, and somebody I'm sure it's a growing field of interest, for sure. I think the larger idea for the data sciences, that we are offering courses, and there will be quite a few courses in the world, definitely in India as well, and we also. So I think somewhere this all gets landed in trying to find some solution to this kind of problem. But thank you so much, Payel, and I appreciate your time, especially on a Saturday evening. Thank you so much from all of us at times.
No, Dr. Nagendra, I thoroughly enjoyed, having this conversation with you and answering all the questions. Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
so
that.
much. Thank you so much. Thank you.